Hey, Freda, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you, Dave?
I am very good and grateful to hear you. It's All Things Considered, member supported Hawaii Public Radio. I'm Dave Lawrence, and Sunday, Island's getting a visit from a gifted vocalist, actress, performer. It's Freda Payne, Band of Gold singer, playing shows at 6:30 and 9 at the Blue Note as a very special 100th birthday celebration for Ella Fitzgerald. And we're lucky because we've got Freda joining us right now to talk all about the show and her fascinating life. Aloha, Freda. Welcome.
Hi. Well, thank you. Welcome. Thank you.
You are quite welcome, and it's going to be great. You got your start as an entertainer and performer at a very young age. When anybody thinks about your career, it goes way beyond some of the songs they may associate with you. And you started both with training at a prestigious school and really early professional experiences. Share some of that story.
Well, I started taking piano lessons when I was about 6 or 7, I believe. And back in Detroit, I'm a Detroiter. That's my home. I was born and reared in Detroit. And that was at the Detroit Conservatory of Musical Arts. Then as a young kid, I studied piano for a while, and then I started to sing when I was 12. What happened was my piano teacher discovered that I had a voice because she wanted to try some voices out for the next piano recital. And when she heard my voice, she said, well, I'm going to give you a solo now. And I had a solo, and the rest was sort of like one thing led to another. My mother's friends started asking me to sing at their church or their banquets. And then I started entering talent contests, sort of like today, how people get discovered on talent contests like American Idol,
Right.
America's Got Talent, and all these different shows. It's the same thing, only now it's just, this is 2017, and that's how you get exposure because you're on television. And even back then, even though it was much on a smaller scale, I was in Detroit, so people all over, let's say the state of Michigan locally, would see me on these talent contests, and one thing led to another. And then I got a chance to audition for a national TV show called the Ted Mack Amateur Hour. They auditioned people in Detroit, and so I won the audition to do it. So they flew me in to New York with my mother, and I was on the show at Ted Mack, and I came in second. That gave me some exposure because after that, I got a big write-up in Jet Magazine. And Jet Magazine was a, African American magazine, but it was like the biggest black publication, along with Ebony magazine that came out monthly, and Jet came out weekly. And Jet was sort of like the go-to news source for, African American people at that time, or whoever wanted to buy a jet, And then when I was also back in Detroit, I was discovered by Berry Gordy Jr. of Motown fame, the founder. But this was before he even started or founded Motown. I'm really I was his first female protege. And at the age of 14, I never signed with Motown, although a lot of people around the world think I was a Motown artist, but I wasn't.
Your mom wouldn't let you sign.
My mom would not agree with his business acumen. His business policy was not to her liking. And so, everybody knew everybody, so life went on and I went on. And then after that, I auditioned for Duke Ellington to be a singer with his band. And I sang with his band a couple of times. And then he wanted me to sign a 10-year contract at the age of 17. So, that wasn't going to happen. And after I graduated from high school, I was 16. And then by the time I turned 18, I went to New York. And that's when I met Quincy Jones. And then he asked me to work with him, perform with him at the Apollo Theater in New York in Harlem. And that was headlining with Billy Eckstine and Red Fox. I was the singer on the show. And that was a wonderful, wonderful experience. And then after that, I got my first record deal with ABC Paramount when I was 19 going on into 20. And I had a single. Then they wanted me to do an album on their jazz label. So my first LP I recorded was a jazz LP. The label was called Impulse. Impulse was like the equivalent of being with Blue Note or Verve, which are jazz labels.
Right.
And so after that, I recorded with the Impulse, and this was in 1963. And then Oh boy, 65, I went to Europe and I was there for like about 6 or 7 months, and I was in Germany, Frankfurt, I was in Paris, I was in Spain, Madrid, I was in Oslo, Norway, I was in Stockholm, Sweden, and while I was in Stockholm, I got to record an album. It was called Freda Payne in Stockholm, and that was recorded in 1965. So then after that, I came back to the States, and I recorded an album in 1966 on MGM Records, and that was called How Do You Say I Don't Love You Anymore? And that was orchestrated by Benny Golson, who is a jazz legend. He was a jazz legend. He is a jazz legend today and was a jazz legend back then. And then in 1969, I became reunited with some fellow Detroiters who were friends of mine, and I went to school with two of them, Brian Holland and then Lamont Dozier. They're better known as Holland, Dozier, and Holland, and they're in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame because they were the guys, they called them the Golden Boys, who came up with all the major early classic hits of Motown. They did the big hits. They're the ones that wrote and produced some of the biggest hits for the Supremes and the biggest hits for the Four Tops, which if you hear most of any of their early hits, they were produced and written by Holland, Dozier, and Holland.
And you were in high school with these guys? I can't believe it.
I was in high school with Brian Holland. I was in middle school for 3 years with Lamont Dozier. So I knew them. Yeah, they were like my old, like old buddies. And it was just one of those things. I had moved to New York. And so I said, now here I moved to New York, and I wind up going back to Detroit before I really found, let's say, turnaround success. And, of course, after that, we're going into the 70s, and then I left that label Invictus and went on, and I signed with a label called ABC, which was still ABC Paramount, but it was called ABC Dunhill by then. And I did 2 albums with them, wonderful albums, Pain and Pleasure, and then Out of Pain Comes Love. And then I signed with Capitol Records in 76. I had a 3-album deal, and I did 3 albums on Capitol, and then into the 80s. And then, of course, then I started doing musical theater. I was actually Leslie Uggams' understudy when I was in New York in a show called Hallelujah Baby, and I went on in a lead role for Leslie. I was on Broadway in a lead role. I did 5 appearances, 5 performances. And then I did, later on, like in the 80s, I did several companies of national company and bus and truck companies of Duke Ellington Sophisticated Ladies. So by saying that, I can say that Duke Ellington finally got me in the long. And then, of course, I did film work. I've done some film and different things like that. And Duke Ellington Sophisticated Ladies wasn't the only Broadway or, let's say, theatrical show that I've done. I've done Blues in the Night, about 7 different companies. Sophisticated Ladies, I've done at least 7 companies of that. I did the first and the only national company of Jelly's Last Jam, which was on Broadway starring Gregory Hines, the late Gregory Hines. And the company that I did was starring his brother, Maurice Hines, and Savion Glover, who was really probably one of the best tap dancers on the planet. And that was a year tour, a whole year. And so then I've just still performed in clubs, and then I started doing tributes to Ella. Actually, I started doing that about as far back as 1999.
Wow.
And then I played Ella in legitimate theater, theatrically. They call it regional theaters. In 2004, I did it in New Brunswick, New Jersey, at a theater called Crossroads. Then I did it again. I recreated the role again in a theater called Metro Stage in Alexandria, Virginia. I've always gotten rave reviews. I got a rave review in the Washington Post for doing Ella at the Metro Stage. And now I'm getting a lot of Lifetime Achievement Awards all over the place from the Urban League and from Giving Back Foundation. And then I was just recently inducted into the Rhythm and Blues Hall of Fame back in Detroit just this past June. And, different things like that. So I'm still in the business. I'm still performing and doing what I do best, singing.
The Ella thing really brings it full circle in so many ways. True, because when you were a young girl, that was a primary influence.
That was my primary influence. It certainly was, yeah.
On the note of the transition to New York, you went through it really fast, but it's a fascinating part. There you are, you're working with Quincy Jones, one of these legendary cats, and you dropped a name really fast through there. I was just curious. Red Foxx, any great memories or encounters of the time that you got to be on the bill with him?
Oh, well, Red Foxx is one of those guys, he was always, in the mix doing stuff, and he was just a funny character, Red Foxx. I mean, if you ever saw him on Sanford and Sons or ever went to see one of his shows in Vegas, he was just like that, off stage as he is on stage. And then I've worked with Bob Hope, and I worked with George Burns, and I worked with Bob Newhart. And I was just noticing today that Glen Campbell passed. When Glen Campbell was doing his variety shows in the 70s, I was on his show, Network, and then I also was on the Bobby Darin show twice. It was 1973. I did the Bobby Darin show twice.
Any particular memories of being on Glen's show?
Not in particular.
You did a lot of shows. You did Merv Griffin, Ed Sullivan, Johnny Carson.
Oh, yeah, Johnny Carson. I did multiple appearances on Johnny Carson. That was back in the 60s. And then I did Merv Griffin a lot. Back in the 60s and the 70s. And Dick Cavett, David Frost. I used to do shows with Arthur Godfrey when he was he had a radio show.
Right.
So I did all these old names, you think about like, wow, this is like showbiz TV history, I worked with him. I worked with and I worked with Sammy Davis several times.
What was the Sammy Davis stuff that you did in the 70s?
I worked with him. I was his opening act.
Wow.
I mean, everywhere, even on Broadway. He worked at the Uris Theater on Broadway. He did some concerts, and I was there with him, along with him and the Nicholas Brothers. Oh, boy, I love Sammy. He was and he still is and always will be the best all-around entertainer in the world.
Did you get personal time with him at all over the runs of dates?
Well, it depends on what you mean by personal time.
Just like hanging out, stuff off stage, maybe learning lessons from him, talking.
Oh, yeah. With Sammy, working with Sammy, it never stopped. I mean, the guy that he is on stage entertaining, he gets off and he's still like that hyper guy that, wanting to always do something or be the consummate entertainer, always being that guy. It's just that it's unfortunate, but he died to me too young. And I think it's because he died from liver cancer. And I remember once we were in Lake Tahoe at Harrah's. It was like a 3-week run, I believe. And I remember he would always have these after parties in his penthouse suite. And he'd have all the people in the show, some of the musicians, some of the chorus girls, and myself up to his suite. And we'd be sitting around like having something to eat or whatever. And I saw him turn. I looked around and he was at the bar pouring a water glass of vodka, which he drank down. I couldn't believe my eyes.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
That's a real, that's some insightful stuff. It's ironic you mentioned that because I actually got to interview Glen a few years back, and in there we're talking about Elvis, and this is back in 2012, so he was still a lot more coherent. It was on that final tour, and he was talking all about how Elvis, like the bodyguards and the way that these people kind of surrounded him and kept him from getting help. And Glen got to observe it up close, kind of like what you're talking about, but a different kind of thing, just watching the deterioration of the king via these folks around him. And that's fascinating. Another cat you were talking about doing things on screen. Nutty Professor 2, Eddie Murphy. Any cool stories?
Eddie, I worked. I did that one movie with him, The Clumps. Nutty Professor, The Clumps.
Right.
Yeah.
Any memories of working with Eddie that stick out?
Nothing particular. I'll tell you one thing. I read an interview from Jamie Foxx when he worked with Eddie, and he said that the thing that he observed was he thought Eddie would be clowning in between shots and stuff like that, in between breaks. And he said it was the opposite. He says Eddie would shut down and just be like, kind of like into like concentrating or just almost thinking about like what he was going to do next and just quiet.
Is that what he was like when you worked with him?
He was like that with me, and I was like, he's cool. He's the moment they say action, he'd go right into his action mode. But then when they would say, okay, cut, and we're waiting for the next shot, he'd just be very peaceful and very quiet. No clowning. No clowning at all.
That's fascinating, and not a surprise actually, because he's a professional, and it's obviously a bit that he can. That unlike, I guess, Sammy, like you were describing, which is 24/7 in that mode.
Yeah, Sammy was like always on.
Right.
Clowning.
How about before we wrap it up, I got to hear Sir Cliff Richard. He was our very special guest, and we actually got to interview him in Sydney right before he did the Opera House down there. You duetted with him on his 2011 Soulicious album and some tour dates. How did you get to?
That's true.
How'd you get to know him, and what's a good story about hanging with him?
Well, I thought he was the most gracious, the most gentlemanly, and very talented man, very talented artist, and he is a 100% class act, totally a 100% class act. That's all I have to say about Cliff Richard. And doing my duet with him was a wonderful experience. The song is called Saving a Life.
Yep.
If anybody wants to go online and check it out, Saving a Life, Cliff Richard's duet with Cliff Richards and Freda Payne.
And you played Band of Gold live too, though, right? You guys were playing that live.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, we did a tour all over the UK. It was a tour, and it was great.
He's fantastic. And
yeah, he's good. He's great. He's great. I love Cliff.
I would have loved to have seen the two of you together. And as we say goodbye, we have somebody in common. The great Bernie Worrell, the keyboardist, was a guest of mine one time. We had a long chat about his whole history and all the different sessions he did.
Uh-huh.
He mentioned you. He had played on the Band of Gold and stuff. Do you remember working with Bernie?
Bernie who?
Bernie Worrell.
Oh, he was on the Band of Gold track?
Yeah, playing keyboards and stuff. Do you remember him?
Oh, not in particular, but I probably would have, if I see him, I'll probably remember who he is.
Okay.
Aloha, this is Freda Payne, and you're right here where you should be with my good friend Dave Lawrence.
It's fantastic. I really enjoyed all your stories. It's riveting, the stuff you've gotten to do.
Well, I'm glad that we got to talk and do this.
It was a lot of fun. I really do appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time today, Freda. We can't wait to see you at the Blue Note on Sunday. 2 shows, 6:30 and 9. Tribute to Ella. It's going to be really special.
Oh, thank you. And I can't wait either.
You be safe. See you soon.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.